Continuing our series of video commentaries for the National Architecture Conference on risk and the role of risk in architecture, we have Professor Rahul Mehrotra, Professor and Chair of Urban Design at Harvard GSD. Rahul speaks about how architectural education and the way in which students, faculty, and the institutions deal with the issue of risk in a creative and productive way is fundamental to the new generation of architects.
So you can have risk at the level of the individual as an architect. So it could be a risk that you get arrested because a building collapses, but it also could be a risk of your reputation over time dissolving. And so similarly, when we talk about climate change and we talk about risk and resilience and all of that, you have slow disasters and very quick disasters. So earthquakes are quick disasters, tsunamis are quick disasters, but because of climate change and ways demographies move or ocean rising, these are slow disasters. So I think the temporal scale is critical in understanding the nature, for us to even calibrate what we mean by risk. And having said that, I think then the notion of risk really resides in community, because I think what extends from risk for us naturally is how do you spread the risk. And so, you can get egoistic about authorship, but then you also are taking the risk of having all the risk on your hands. Whereas when you become more collaborative and as communities extend and work together, basically you're spreading risk. And community building is about spreading risk. It's about collective, it's about the collective, and the collective is always about minimizing risk, which is, I think, what our instinct is as human beings. But then, risk is also related to values. So the nature of risk is dependent on the values you bring to a project, to a commission or whatever. So if the values I bring to it are just to make money, then my risk is of a different kind and actually quite limited to making money or not making money. I risk my bets on that. But if the values I bring to it is community building, about making an artifact that helps society in some way, that can perform in terms of its sustainable dimensions, all of that, then the nature of risk changes. And so we often narrow risk down, and maybe the word risk is the wrong one, but we narrow it down to something that implicates us in some way, which usually has to do with our reputation or has to do with a financial implication. That is a terribly narrow definition of risk. And so I think the moment we begin to nuance risk and calibrate it differently, both using a temporal kind of scale, but also a scale that allows us to measure it on a value scale, I think it becomes a complicated but a much more nuanced definition, which then I think begins to pose the possibilities of using it both positively, to leverage it, because the risks then can lead to many gains, so to speak. And so I think for us to use the notion of risk effectively as a profession, we have to necessarily, nuance it across a temporal and a scale of values. Yeah, I think in the contemporary world, the risks that we take on architectural projects are much more complex. I would use the word complex more than are greater or less, because the interconnectedness of different systems in a building, the different protocols and processes that make a building and how we operate within them has become very risky business. But I think the way we had imagined risk in terms of how we are implicated is completely different, and that differs in different cultures and different societies, all the way from the way you're covered by insurance to the way that you're covered in terms of your reputation. And I think different cultures deal with both these questions quite differently. And eventually it really is, if you want to boil it down very pointedly to two aspects, it's really reputation and financial risks that become the umbrellas under which a lot can be organized, so to speak. And so you can nuance financial risks, which take on different forms, and then the safety nets for those risks take on a different form, and they're different abstract in different places. And then the risks for reputation are completely different. And again, you can nuance that, and in terms of at one end of the spectrum, whether you'd get your next commission because you took a risk on something and it didn't work out, versus a cumulative risk that then allows you to scale up your operation. There is a consensus in society that they entrust you with particular kinds of commissions, and that's sort of reputation. And that's where the temporal scale becomes important, because some are very quick and some are very slow. From what I'm seeing, they take much greater risks, and the greater risks sometimes come by default and sometimes come consciously. I think the use of interface technology in design processes in education have changed dramatically. The way, to put that simply, that we use computers and softwares and all of that. And so really students are getting less committal, and therefore in a funny way they're taking a risk, but the consequence of the risks have diminished. Just a simple example, when you make a drawing, when we hand drew drawings using stencils and French curves and stuff, to retract stuff was harder. So every moment was a greater commitment and therefore a greater risk. Today with the automation, every move, a creative move, is less of a risk and much more reversible, both in terms of time and effort. And I think that has a massive bearing. So therefore, one could argue that interface technology allows explorations, and perhaps risk then doesn't become the right word there.